Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Jean Burgess. Hey, Jean, how are you doing?
I'm great. Happy to be here.
Excellent. I'm happy to have you here. And we were just chatting about the fact that I think after following each other on probably Facebook for a long time, we ran into each other in person at an event that Jane Friedman was speaking at, which is just a lovely example of why it's important to get out there in the world and see people in person. So that was super fun. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Jean Burgess is a writer, editor, playwright, and workshop presenter. As a former professional stage actor and director, many of her written works relate to the performing arts, including her debut novel, That Summer She Found Her Voice, and her nonfiction book, Collaborative Stage Directing. Before diving into a writing career, Jean taught theater and speech communications for 23 years, and she holds an MA in theater from Northwestern University and a Ph.D. in educational theater from New York University. And we're going to be talking today about one of my favorite things to talk about with guests, which is how they have applied past careers or past experiences that seem perhaps outside of the writing and publishing world to their writing and publishing work. And so, not surprising, based on your bio, we're going to be talking about how theater has influenced your writing and your creative work. And so I thought a fun way to go about this would just be to mention some of the things that I think people naturally associate with theater and have you talk a little bit about how you see that playing out in your creative writing life. And so I think that the first one, this is maybe like the most obvious one, is acting. How do you see acting playing out in your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I do a workshop for writers on this very topic, and I ask them to think like an actor, think like a director, think like a playwright, think like a set designer and costume designer. And it's very hands-on when it comes to acting because writers are sometimes introverted. And I actually make them go through an improvisation exercise. And then I talk about another strategy, an acting strategy. So I'll share that because as I was writing my fiction, I found myself falling back on these couple of ideas. So the exercise I use in my workshop is improvisation first. So how does that help in writing? And it really does in a couple of ways. First of all, it doesn't matter whether you're a pantser or whether you're an outliner. Sometimes pantsers have us kind of go wandering, and then you're like kind of stuck because, oh, where is this thing going? Or if you're an outliner, you get very rigid. You know, I have this outline, and oh no, the character wants to take us in a different direction. So improvisation, even though it sounds like it's just a free for all, and actors just go nuts with it, it actually is very structured. There's a very famous improv yes and you have to work within that structure of every line that you say in the improv is yes and it really makes you think, but it's also fun and it's opens your mind to kind of creative, fun responses. So improvisation and introducing that to writers has been fun when I present the workshop. As a writer myself, I use this method acting. Stanislavski used it with his Russian actors way back in the 19th century, called the magic if. And he used it in the rehearsal room for the actors to dig deeper into their characters. Well, I found myself, while I was writing my debut fiction, I found myself actually using it to dig deeper. If I got stuck in a plot point, I would go, okay, well, what if, and I would journal several different ways that this could go. What if the characters did this? What if this happened externally to them? What if, and I would have several different directions to go and then sit back and contemplate. I mean, I think that's a typical exercise that writers use. I also found when I started to work on the sequel, which is going to be published in the spring, I know I have this character, but what is going to happen now? And I started to use this magic if strategy. So that is another way that my acting training has sort of transferred into my writing.
With the yes and, do you see that similarly as a good way of
Yes.
brainstorming your way out of a corner?
any kind of improv. I mean, I would encourage writers to take an improv class and use any kind of improvisation. I talk about improvisation more as opening your mind, being open to those people who tend to have their mind like a trap, especially if you're an outliner.
Mhm.
If you work from an outline and you don't want to stray from that outline. We need to be both left brain and right brain if we're working from an outline.
Yeah, as soon as you said improv, I wrote down improv, arrow, pantsing. Because it does feel like there's some commonalities there, like the people who are more comfortable with improv are going to be probably people who are more comfortable with pantsing. But I like that idea of using it as a brain exercise, a brain opener.
Yeah.
And do you find that the acting part also influences things like action and dialogue? Like I do talk to authors who say that their neighbors probably think they're crazy because they act out the things that they're writing, they speak aloud the dialogue. Do you find yourself doing that or advise people to do that?
Well, I do. And I will say that if you are someone who gets stuck in dialogue, can't write dialogue or don't feel like you can write natural dialogue, improv is another great way to relax into it. Because, you have a part, if you go to an improv class, you have a partner, you're talking off the top of your head, you're in a situation. A typical improv is you're in a place, you're two people, you're two characters. Here's the conflict, go. So you have to put yourself in there and you have to talk it out within those confines.
Yeah.
So some folks struggle with dialogue. Yeah.
Well, I realize that when I'm writing dialogue, I'm usually writing it as if I were another person in the room and I'm overhearing what the conversation is. It's helpful for me to think about it
Ah,
like I'm watching a movie that I'm it just seems very natural, like, at the point where I really know the characters well, and so I feel like I can step back a little bit and let them talk amongst themselves and then see if that's making sense.
that's
It's kind of
very
like watching a
interesting.
play, you know? It
That's very interesting. So my process is very different, and I think it's because of my background, because I was a professional actor for so many years. I actually step into the role of each one of my characters.
Mhm.
So when I'm writing dialogue, I become that character.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think that the benefit of that is maybe you get a deeper perspective, and then I can imagine the downside of that for me would be, like, task switching between characters, like, I'd almost have to go through a whole string of dialogue embedded in one character and then go back and, like, check it against now I'm in the other character rather than trying to hop from character to character. Interesting.
Well, yeah, and I will say I do that in my editing process. So I will go through all of the one character, making sure that there's consistency with that character, and then I will go back and take another run in another character, if they're main characters, and go through, make sure there's consistency. It's a process with me. I can't
Yes.
whip out a book every 3 months.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked a bit about acting. How about directing? How do you see directing in a theater sense as being applicable to writing?
Yeah. So also, I was a director for many, many years. And those skills are all about spatial. So a director's job is to envision the play, um, about moving actors around the furniture, around the set pieces, entrance, exits. And so our job as a writer is the same thing. When we are writing, we have to envision, the apartment, and where is the kitchen, and where's the bedroom, and where is the murderer going to enter, and where is the murder weapon that he drops or she drops, and how do they exit, so that we can go back and recreate that when the police enter to do the investigation or whatever. The same thing for fantasy, the island, and where is the cave that the dragon lives, and where's the food source and the water source, and where do the villagers have to, you have to envision all of that. And you can't make a mistake because the readers will let you know, and it's sloppy writing, right? So that's where the director's mind, it's all about visualization and the spatial relationship. And so that's one aspect, right? And then what you said earlier about being sort of the taking the step back and looking at the actors interacting. That's sort of the film director's point of view. Same thing with the stage director once we get into rehearsal, but is now writing all of the action. And a lot of times you'll see some books where they sort of gloss over the action. All of a sudden the waiter puts the food down, but nobody eats, nobody puts creamer or sugar in their coffee. And that sounds mundane, but you can have fun with those actions. And, a character does certain quirky things with the way they drink their coffee so it's not to be glossed over. And a director's mind kind of zooms in on those things too. But, and they're important actions. So always, you write your draft and then you take the step back, as you mentioned, you take that step back and you put on your director's hat and you go, oh, how can I enhance that scene? Have I glossed over action? So those are kind of the two aspects that I view my writing second draft.
Yeah, it made me think of two things. One is in that sort of like the blocking or logic thing. I wrote a book, I think it was my fifth Lizzie Ballard book, where I had to make a PowerPoint presentation of where the cars were, when, and with whom. Because I realized at one point in a draft, I had like a car had gotten somewhere else, but there was nobody that could have driven it there. And so I had these slides that would say, in chapter 1, here's where all the cars are, and here's what the cars are. Chapter 2, they've moved, this car has moved from here to here, but this car is still here. The book I'm working on now, the same thing is with phones. So I had to have I do spreadsheets for a lot of things. I have to have columns in the spreadsheet saying, where is the protagonist's cell phone here? Where is the antagonist's sat phone here? But the other thing I think you're saying is that I find fascinating is this idea, fascinating and a challenge is this idea of how much of that blocking do you describe, like you're suggesting. And I think a great companion piece to this conversation will be episode 268, which is what authors should not learn from movies with Renee Gutteridge. And one of Renee's pieces of advice is that writers who come to writing after being very enthusiastic moviegoers will often write the movie as if they're directing it. Like, John came into the kitchen, he went to the cupboard, he opened the door and he took out a mug, he filled the mug with coffee. And that's like the kind of detail that's not useful. And it's the kind of detail that I find I put a lot of in my first drafts. And I was, in fact, I was overhauling a scene where there's a woman who's living in an almost closed mall, nearly deserted mall. And I got fascinated with the logistics of how does somebody live in a mall without getting caught. And so I was putting way too much stuff in about how she disposed of her garbage and where she brushed her teeth and all this stuff. And I finally thought, okay, that was fascinating for me, but that's really going to bog things down if it makes it into the final. So I think that is it's such a tricky decision to make about how much is too much. And then balancing that with, I realize as a reader, if I have someone sitting at the table and suddenly they're rinsing a dish in the sink, I'm disconcerted unless I have some indication that they've gotten up from the table and they've gone to the sink. Do you have any advice you could offer based on your theater experience about how to judge where that right balance is?
Well, I think it comes from theater and I think it comes from directing, because directors always have a concept for every show that they direct, a concept. So I think that's kind of carried over into my writing. So my books, That Summer She Found Her Voice, is a retro novel. So it takes place in 1978. And so the concept for my book, or sort of the overarching theme, which all writers have, right? I would assume all writers have, the genre is kind of the overarching theme, I suppose, should sort of shine through in a way and maybe be the guide for some of these actions. At least, for my debut fiction, at least that's what was my guide. So the actions for this book and then the sequel, which takes place in the early 80s, still part of this retro genre. I totally made up that genre, by the way, because it wasn't historical fiction, but it wasn't exactly contemporary fiction. But having some sort of overarching can kind of be your guide, sort of like a director uses a concept. So at least that's what's worked for me,
Mhm.
like from my directing roots. So I don't know. For me, I would get into how does she dispose of her garbage without being caught?
Yeah.
How does she facilitate some of those actions? To me, that would, I would want to know that. But you do have to figure this out is what stays in and what is too mundane.
Yeah. But once you've dropped in a couple of details, and this is just like a scene or two where she's dealing with it. The protagonist is actually she's having to stay overnight in a mall and she's interacting with a woman who lives there. So in the scope of the book, it's not,
Oh,
it's
okay.
not as much detail as there would be if the protagonist was spending her whole time living in the mall.
Okay.
But I guess that dropping in those couple of things that indicate like the need for stealth and the need for quiet and, a couple of examples of how you deal with things that would be completely easy and non-challenging to deal with if you were living in a home might be sufficient. And then I also like what you're suggesting about the details you highlight or the details that are important to the concept or the theme of your book. And so this is reminding me of a conversation I had with Diane Valere, who, among other books, writes a book about a woman who is inspired by Doris Day. And all her clothes are like Doris Day inspired. And I was saying, in my books, clothing is not an issue. Like I have a joke in one of my books about the protagonist that her entire wardrobe comes from LL Bean. So once I've said that, I don't have to say anything else. Like you can picture what she's wearing. Her entire wardrobe comes from LL Bean. But with Diane, like her readers are there because they want to know about like the skirt and the colors and the kind of blouse. And like that's what she's writing about. And so details that
Right.
would be very silly if I were to put them in my book about clothing are very appropriate if she's putting it her book about clothing.
Right. And so in my books, the clothing is very, because it's all this retro 70s. And in the second book, I have all these different characters. One is a fashionista roommate of Margie, who is very Princess Diana, straight laced, very of that period. And then there's a punkster waitress who befriends them, who works at the diner down the street. And this is all in New York City, early 1980s. So all of that, the clothing is very important to the character.
Yes.
Again, concept, what's important and what isn't. But that can be the guiding light.
Yes. Yeah. And what are your readers there to find out? What will they have
Yeah.
patience for? What will they not have patience for?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a connected one, which is set design. I love that you had set design as one of the aspects that you brought forward into your writing. I'm guessing this is sort of like an expansion of what we've been talking about with regard to clothing as an example.
Yes,
But can
in
you
a
talk about
sense.
set design as an inspiration?
Yeah, and set design and costume design kind of goes together. So a lot of times when I do this workshop, folks don't really know how set designers and costume designers work in the theater. And so their job, both, is to create the world of the play.
Mhm.
And what do? We writers create the world of the book. The way they work is that the designer does a lot of research, even if it's contemporary, around this concept that the director has. But if it's any type of period piece, or even if it's contemporary, but it's set in a different city, or if it's fantasy or whatever, using the director's concept, idea, theme, or whatever, they go to work and they research and they'll pull photos of architecture, or maps, props. That would be the set designer. And then the costumer, same thing. Costumes that might work for the idea if it's period. In my case, 70s. I was talking about the punkster outfit, the Princess Diana outfits, the fashionista, the business of New York City business attire, accessories, makeup, anything like that. So what I did for my research is exactly that. I had two boards, one for set design. It takes place in New York City, mostly in Manhattan. My main character is a receptionist at Radio City Music Hall. So, of course, Radio City, all these landmarks where she, as a 26-year-old, would hang out. So, Central Park, the diner on the corner, what her walk-up apartment would look like, pre-World War II apartment, all of that stuff. It's all on a vision board. And it sits in my office. Same thing with the costumes, sits in my office. Um, Also, I tend to be, with my characters, I'm one of those sticklers for writing complete character backgrounds, profiles. So those images are helpful. What would the punk look like? What would her makeup look like? I got a great idea. I thought it was very funny that every scene she comes in, she's completely dyed her hair a different color. So it's pink and it's turquoise and it's got, these streaks the next time. So I thought that was a little funny through line for her character, but that would be typical for her. She's a little crazy like that. So it was just fun. But anyway, when I got stuck in my writing, having those visuals in my office, not stuck, but, just sometimes needed inspiration or needed a direction or the characters needed to talk to me. I have those there. So that's the same way that the designers work. They would have all those visual inspiration in the studio for all their team to use for inspiration as well as they continue to work on a show. So that's the way that I would, was inspired by those roots because I also did my share of set work and costuming through the years. Yeah, and my books are, it might sound like just a fluff theme. Oh, and that summer she found her voice. It's a young girl from a small town and she tours as a singer with a swing band around the country and her eyes are open to bigger issues. But what I actually do is tie in themes from the late 70s. So I did a lot of research and merging feminism, racial injustice that she wasn't aware of, her spiritual journey, things like that were issues in the late 70s. And with this next book, New York in the early 80s had its own share of issues. They had a cocaine crisis. They had a disease with no name yet, which we knew was AIDS. They had a huge anti-nukes protest where they were only expecting 100,000 people, and it turned out to be like 1 million people in Central Park.
Oh, wow.
So I wove that into the story. So just interesting things on the socio-political spectrum that I wove into the story. So there's a lot of research that goes into it. It's not just about a young girl's career if you're in the big city.
Yeah, well, you're building the compelling world that makes the story that takes place in it more engaging. I can imagine that my version of set design is that for the book I'm working on now, there's a scene that takes place in a remote cabin. Many of my scenes take place in remote cabins in northern Pennsylvania. And I went through lots and lots of iterations of it. So at first it was like a very small rustic cabin. Then for a while it was kind of like a temporary cabin, like a trailer. And then I realized the suspenseful benefits of having it be a larger building, part of which is closed off because it's off season. When I finally landed on the general gestalt I wanted, old, historic, big cabin, only part of which is being used, I made a floor plan. And then it was very useful because on a subsequent pass through my draft, I could see where I needed to adjust in order to accommodate this new model. And then I had a scene where, the bad guy is chasing the good guy. And so where does he hide? Oh, I see there happens to be a closet right across the room where he's going to catch up with her. So obviously he would hide there. And when your world starts informing your story that way, I think that's a really fun point.
Yes, that's part of what the director does too, because the director will have a floor plan and then work in conjunction with the set designer as well. So really good point about that spatial, having that. That's exactly what I'm talking about, using these skills. And some writers don't do that, and then they get caught because it's like, oh, wait, but you didn't mention that before. Or, well, wait, you mentioned that, but that was where the door to the balcony was or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they get caught. So, yeah, I have all kinds of floor plans. I have maps. I have a map of Manhattan now. So how many subway stops would that take to get there? Or would they just walk? You don't use the subway if it's only 2 blocks.
I
things like
remember
that.
reading a book where someone had taken, they were on a business trip. They were like flying, going from city to city on a extended business trip. And they flew from Philadelphia to New York. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I live outside Philadelphia. I don't know anyone who would fly from Philadelphia to New York.
Take the train.
Yes, exactly. You could Uber there for cheaper, faster and cheaper than you could get a plane.
Right. That's hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah,
But that's important stuff. And you do
yeah,
need to check your facts. Yeah.
yeah. One of the other things that I like about the idea of thinking of this as a play rather than a movie, and this is not a pro or con thing, it's just I'm just expressing my own preferences that I love when I can make like a location do double duty. I mean, that's true of everything. I feel that way about characters. I feel that way about settings. I feel that way about everything. And so oftentimes I'll finish a first draft of a story and I'll have, scenes that take place in the rustic cabin, then I have scenes that take place somewhere else. My goal is always, well, can I make them all take place at the rustic cabin? Like the more consolidated it is, the better I like it. Can I combine these two characters to make them one? It's almost always the better choice for my books to have it be more condensed like that. And I like that idea of it's almost like the stage as opposed to the movie screen. Like the movie screen,
Yeah.
you can go anywhere, but with the stage, that's what you have. And you have to make the action work within those physical bounds.
Yeah. That is such a great point. When I was teaching playwriting on the college level, my young playwrights who were new to it would write scenes like different locations as if it were a screenplay. And I
Yeah.
would have to explain the difference, when we're talking about stage playwriting, and you can't have that many. Think about this poor set designer having to bring in new scenery
Yeah.
and trying to get that through their heads. But that's an excellent point,
Mm.
too. Now I'm going to add that to my notes.
Excellent.
Thank you, Matty.
Well, thinking of set design, my husband and I have been on a little jag of taking the train into New York to see plays. And what I notice for certain plays is that they very rarely now like wheel out the whole living room set and wheel in the bedroom set or whatever. Like they're almost
Right.
always indicating the setting with a couple of items. Like
Yes.
now they've brought in a vase of flowers, or now they've brought in, a coffee pot. Now a coffee pot is on the table instead of a can of pencils. And so you know what that
Yeah.
says about
It went from office to kitchen or
yeah,
office to,
yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think that those can be for those people where those kinds of details are not vital to the concept, the way like details of clothing are for your books and Diane Blair's books. Those can be good. Like if you just need to mention a thing or two to sort of orient the reader, then thinking about it in terms of I'm a set designer and I have a limited budget that I can only change out a couple of things. I have a limited financial budget and I have limited time, or what are the couple of things I'm going to
Yeah.
swap out on the stage to indicate what the setting is now could be a good clue for what are the couple of
Yeah.
things I need to tell the reader.
I love that. Like, this just popped into my head, but starting a chapter with, on the park bench. Yeah. That's all you need.
Exactly.
Everybody knows park bench, you're probably in a park.
Yes. Yeah. And if it's the crumbling park bench, then it's different than if it's the elegant wrought iron park
Excellent.
bench or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that one thing that I look back on my early books and I wish I'd done less of was keep looping back to clothes because it's not particularly important for me. But, just describing, like I had a very elegant woman show up in a Philadelphia townhouse and I was describing her clothing to indicate that she was an elegant woman. But I realized in retrospect, I only needed to mention like one thing, like her silk dress or whatever. And then people would get the idea.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Being new to fiction myself, since I came from an academic background, all my academic articles, and then I wrote a nonfiction academic book. So I'm new to it. And I think I'm falling into my first book, I fell into that trap. My second book, I did less of that. So I think it's something that as newer writers, we think you have to do,
Yeah.
and you don't.
Yeah.
So that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point.
Well, the other thing that I have done, especially for the primary characters, is give very little physical description
Mhm.
because I kind of, and thinking of it again in like playwriting terms and theater terms, I kind of want the reader to be able to cast the story themselves. And there are
Mm.
going to be a couple of things that are key, like does she have a hairstyle that she has to blow dry every morning, or does she just whack it back in a ponytail? Like that's important in telling. But people don't necessarily need to know what color her eyes were and what color her hair was and all those details that sometimes, you get into and you think, I didn't really need that much information. Are there other playwriting? We kind of skipped right over playwriting. We kind of keep looping back to it, but other tips that you pulled just from playwriting in general that authors can learn from?
We touched on it a little
Mhm.
bit in terms of what I learned from playwriting is because as a playwright, you really only have the character's dialogue to move the action forward, of
Mhm.
course. And so I think that really helped me as a writer with writing good dialogue and making it count and showing emotion through dialogue and moving plot forward through dialogue and not getting hung up on uh, dialogue that doesn't do anything, which is a common mistake with newer fiction writers. It's just mundane dialogue that's not necessary, easy to cut. So that's what I took away from my plays that I've written in the past. And I do, I get nice compliments about, oh, that dialogue really added to the scene. So I do have a lot of that. And also character development, because as an actor and as a playwright, as I mentioned, I do heavy duty character development, lots of profiles, background, character background, do the whole 9 yards of that. Sometimes I get caught on that. In this book that's coming up in the spring, I thought this was going to be a minor character. It turned out to be my protagonist's love interest. So I was like, oh dear, I didn't really develop that
Whoops.
character and had to go back. Sometimes it catches you.
Yeah.
Like I said, sometimes the characters go one way and you thought your outline was doing this. But then I just went back. I took a break, went back and did the work. But yeah, always call that the homework. And I think it's important.
I think
And
I
I
can,
always did that in my playwriting as
yeah.
well. Developed all the characters.
I
Yeah.
can imagine a benefit or a lesson from playwriting could be ways to avoid the, I won't do that, she said angrily. Yes, you will, he said insistently. You can't make me, she said with murder in her voice or whatever. To what extent would a script say, she said angrily? Or to what
Yeah, and you
extent is
wouldn't.
the script relying on, how does the script convey that to the actors who are portraying it? And are there lessons to be learned there for writers?
Yeah. So, well, one thing is we very much try not to, you know, character name, parentheses, angrily, and then the line. You try not to because you try to give the actors creative freedom.
Mhm.
You try to write the line in a way that emotes that.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean, that it does give you a lot of practice to write a line in a way that shows that. And then the actor knows, oh, uh, my character is angry here. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's written in a way that the actor goes, oh, I could try it this way. I could try it this way. So, I shouldn't say it's cut and dry every time.
Yeah.
But you try to avoid those parentheses unless it's really imperative that it has to be that way in
Yeah.
order to propel the action. So you try to limit those. And in writing, we try not to do that either. He said angrily. You try to have the line written in a way that already is showing that. So
Right.
that's why playwriting is very good practice
Yeah.
for writing dialogue in a way that shows emotion and moves the plot forward and also shows, other aspects of character, personality, and things like that.
Yeah. I think for any of these things, there's never a cut and dry rule. And I think that everybody read the line from Stephen King about, you know, not using the adverbs. Then everybody decided adverbs were a bad thing. But what I see sometimes is that the way writers will try to solve that problem is, I won't do that, she said, crossing her arms. I think you will, he said, putting his fists on his hips. You can't make me, she said, wagging her finger at his face. Like, I know it's good periodically to use a person's actions to illustrate their feeling, but that's just as bad as like adverb, adverb, adverb. So all of these things in moderation, I suppose.
Yeah, I know. We have to just take that run through during revisions or during editing and go, am I overdoing this? Am I
Yeah.
overdoing this? Am I overdoing this? And, I'm huge on revisions, but taking a run specifically for each one of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Am I overdoing? I think some of that is appropriate as long as it's appropriate for that character. Is that a character action? Is my character, Miguel, constantly doing this when he's upset or
Yeah.
yanking his hair out? Then we know, okay, well, that's specific to him. But if three characters do that every time they're upset, now I agree with you. That's too much. And
Yeah.
that's sort of lazy writing.
So, Jean, so thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on what you learned from theater that you apply to your writing. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you, your books, and everything you do online.
Sure. Well, my website is jeanburgessauthor.com. And there's information on how to get my books there. They're available on any online retailer, Amazon, bookshop.org, which I encourage folks to use because it helps indie bookstores, and we're all about that.
Yes.
Barnes and Nobles, any online retailer.
Great.
So
Thank you
I've
so
been,
much.
yeah, thank you. I love being here.